So our next panel is Shirley Bloomfield, delivering gigabit service to your community. So maybe Shirley can tell you what it says in the ladies' room. Shirley?
Good morning. Okay, I'll admit it. There is a sign in the women's restroom as well. And it's pretty similar. And I did come out and actually ask the receptionist about it. I was a little baffled, but I'd love to have my panel. I know somebody's getting mic'd up, but have our folks come join us. What we're going to talk about this morning with this group, which I am really excited about, is gig communities. We're hearing a lot about a gig, the opportunity to take a gigabit per second and to go ahead and build. Gentlemen, please have a seat. And build out. And it's one of those things where I know that many of you have been offering that kind of service to your business customers for a long time now. But now there's a lot of emphasis on how do you roll that out into your entire service territory. So I've got a really unique, terrific panel here together that's going to talk to you a little bit about their perspective. And I'm actually going to do a very brief introduction of everybody, but I've asked them all to start off with a couple of minutes. Just to share and put in perspective their kind of view and where they're coming from, because I think we've got some really interesting perspectives here. So first we have Gary Johnson, who's the CEO and General Manager for Paul Bunyan up in Minnesota. Gary has been a regular at NTCA for a while. He took over as the CEO of Paul Bunyan a few years ago. Been very active in the industry. He's somebody whose brain I tap a great deal for a number of different items, and partially because Gary came up through the company doing computer programming and running marketing and doing a lot of the technology things. And one of the things that's very exciting that he's going to talk a little bit about is the GigaZone project that Paul Bunyan has just rolled out to their folks. We have Don Macke, who is the co-founder and director for the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship. And as we talk about economic development and job creation, the idea of how you keep these entrepreneurs in rural America, I think, becomes even more intriguing to all of us. So Don spends a lot of time helping communities and regions figuring out how to develop strategies and paths forward. He also does a lot of interesting work, I think, in community development in the philanthropy area, which I think is also kind of an intriguing area for all of us to be thinking about and looking at. And certainly, last but not least, we have Joe Reardon, who I think if I talk about Google Fiber, Kansas City, Kansas immediately comes to mind for many of you. Because when Google was looking for their first community in kind of a beauty contest to roll out their gig opportunities, Joe was actually the mayor of Kansas City, Kansas at that time. He's got a very extensive background in private legal practice, serving as the mayor at a really interesting time, and I'm really anxious to pick his brain about what that took and what some of those discussions with Google were like. But he's also spending time now doing a lot of work in economic development, working a lot with the state of Kansas on different economic boards, really looking at what drives innovation and what is driving economies of the future. So I'm delighted. I've got a terrific panel. I don't expect to have to do much today, but I'm going to go ahead and ask each one of you, if you don't mind, to go ahead and just take a couple minutes, tell us a little bit about your perspective, and then I've got a load of questions for you. So, Gary, you have the lucky honor of sitting next to me, so you get to go first.
All right. Well, thanks, Shirley, and good morning, everyone. As Shirley said, I'm with Paul Bunyan Communications. We are, like you, we're an ILEC, we're a CLEC. We're located in north central Minnesota. We cover about 5,000 square miles. Just to give you a sense of size, we're about 125 employees, about 30,000 access lines, 18,000 video data. And so that gives you a sense of where we're at. We've had a little excitement lately. In September, we did make a gigabit announcement. And for us, it's been meaningful in a lot of ways. And I know we're going to talk a lot about what some of those ways are. But it's really, I think, re-energized our company internally as well as our perception externally. So I look forward to our conversation about gig. But we are covering 5,000 square miles with our gigabit network, so it's an aggressive rollout across, just like the areas you serve, very rural, not densely populated by any stretch. And so it's a challenge financially, it's a challenge technically, but absolutely I'm very happy we've done it. I think it's the right thing to do, and we'll talk more about that. So thanks.
Terrific.
Great.
Don.
Thanks, Shirley. our organization works out across North America, and I've been at this for over 40 years, and one of the things we've come to believe at the center is that one of the best strategies for rural development is this idea that you've got people who have made the choice to live in rural communities, and supporting those entrepreneurs, creating better ventures, really becomes a very powerful economic development strategy. So what we do is work with communities and regions, helping them figure out how to become better at helping the entrepreneurs who are already in their midst grow better businesses, and as a result, grow stronger economies. Shirley, I'd also note that it's interesting, I was talking to one of the earlier panelists, and today in our small organization, we spend more on information technology than we do on travel. And I've got communities that I've worked with that I've never personally met, but with video conferencing and other technology, we're able to extend our footprint, lower cost, and do a lot more work than we could even 10 years ago.
Good morning,
Joe.
Shirley. I'm really glad to be here with you. I was the mayor of Kansas City, Kansas, when Google Fiber announced us as the first city in the United States for their fiber install. We, over the course of time, I was mayor for 8 years, looked at, on our own, a broadband infrastructure project for Kansas City, Kansas, and for all kinds of good reasons decided that it wasn't something we were going to do by ourselves. So when Google announced this contest, if you will, it provided a real opportunity for our community to form what became a really great public-private partnership to install gigabit infrastructure throughout Kansas City, Kansas. And we saw that as an infrastructure play, just like streets and sidewalks and sewers, quite frankly, are for cities. And I think what we're seeing now across the country are more towns and cities are looking at this as a real need and opportunity for their communities and trying to find out, is there a public-private partnership that might work? Of course, cities are going in all kinds of different directions, but ours really at the core was a public-private partnership with Google that allowed our community to move forward with this kind of infrastructure, and I'm excited to talk about it.
That's great. So I know there's a little bit of inside baseball here, but I'd love to kind of pursue with you, Joe. There was this whole buzz about Google coming in. They're going to go somewhere. Who's going to get it? So obviously, anytime you do a negotiation, there's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be incentives. There may be things you can share. There may be things you can't share. But, and again, I think different scale for our membership. But, what kind of things were thrown out in the discussion? How did you and Google find that perfect place to come together and actually decide to do this?
Right. I think a lot of people, when the contest was announced, 1,100 cities applied. So I think a lot of people didn't quite know how this would work. I'm not sure if Google knew exactly how it would work at the very beginning. But they didn't call one day and give us the golden ticket, I will tell you that. It became a dialogue that turned into a negotiation, and it really was a public-private partnership. And the negotiation didn't center, quite frankly, around tax incentives or some kind of discount on a fee being paid to the city, quite frankly. And in economic development terms, I mean, we're very used, most cities and towns are used to being involved in an economic development deal by giving an incentive away. This was a very different approach. And their interest really was to figure out if our city was capable of moving as fast as they wanted to move with the install. And the negotiation really became a negotiation around eliminating or changing regulatory schemes that the city had had for a long time, that cities everywhere have, to sort of align our resources with their installation in a way that would allow them to install quickly and seamlessly to the extent that they could. The second part of it, the negotiation was all cities and towns have something valuable, and that's our rights of way. And so talking about access to right-of-way, streamlining of right-of-way, shared resources in some cases to allow quick access or install, those became the core parts of our negotiation with Google. And I think really the lesson for Kansas City, Kansas at the end of that was it was a great thing for policymakers like a mayor to go back into a regulatory environment that for most cities you just don't look at for a long time and start to think about how can we make this easier for businesses to interact with us, not just in this kind of a project, but in all kinds of projects. And we really started to rethink our regulatory environment and not giving away the protections that the city needs to have on behalf of its citizens and the corporate entity of the city, but aligning the way we do business with those that seek to do business with us and understanding what their needs are too. I mean, in a public-private partnership, there's a private side. Google's interests sometimes align with the cities, but at the end of the day, they're installing a network to make a profit. And at the end of the day, from a public policy standpoint, we're interested in providing that next generation infrastructure to our citizens and our businesses. And when you can find those two things aligned, then you can start to really, I think, change the way you do business to allow that opportunity to happen. And that's really, in fact, what went on in our negotiation with Google.
So I'm going a little bit offline here, but you mentioned rights of way. One of the things I've heard a lot at this meeting, actually, has been the concern on rights of way. Railroad rights of way. I had no idea that that was such a big deal. I mean, were railroads also included as, do you have any lines that cut through?
Railroads were not part of our rights of way discussion. We do have, Kansas City is the second largest rail hub in the United States, so railroads are everywhere, right? But Google designed the system where it really was the city's rights of way, and we own our municipal utility. So we had pole infrastructure that we owned as well. And so access to the poles and setting up a regulatory scheme that made sense to them and other incumbents on the poles, those were the kinds of things that we really held control over and that we could start to rethink and re-engineer the way we approached.
Okay. So, Don, you mentioned, IT, technology. It's also important. And when the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, it sounds really cool. But if you could just share a little bit, what exactly do you all do, and how do you see, the need for higher speed broadband kind of playing into entrepreneurship, economic development, all those pieces?
Yeah, I think maybe one way to think about it is this creates opportunity for development. And I mentioned in my first comments that people make the choice of where they want to live, and that's a trend, urban and rural. And one of the stories, Shirley, I shared with you when we were doing the planning call was this couple we met in the Redwood Coast area of Northern California. And, I asked them, why are you there? And they said, this is where we want to live. And I said, well, how do you make a living? And they had this neat business where basically they were both geologists. They created samples for museums and universities. Their market was the Pacific Rim, primarily the growing universities in China. And I said, well, how can you do this? Because they were up this road in this very rural setting. And they said, all we need is high-speed internet, which we have, and same-day parcel service. And so a lot of it comes back to opportunity. But part of that opportunity is access to the technology. That makes the difference. That allows people to pursue a whole set of kind of businesses. So when we talk to entrepreneurs and we ask them, okay, what's essential for you in a rural setting, and for that matter, I think in an urban setting like Kansas City, is they say attitude and field. Is the community progressive? Is it open to change? They're interested in places and spaces. They're maybe in a rural area because they want to have an acreage with some horses. And then in that list, they're going to say technology, the ability to support smart devices, high-speed internet. But I think one of the things, and we'll maybe talk more about this, is application help. How can they really learn how to use the emerging technologies in ways to advance not only their lifestyle, but clearly their business pursuits?
Yeah. So when you're talking about access to technology, how do communities express what they're looking for? Do they do inventories? Do they do assessments? If you build it, they will come? Is it a leap of faith?
I think it's a struggle for communities. And, of course, we tend to get into smaller, more isolated rural communities as part of our portfolio. And so any kind of strategic assessment, this will be on the list, and they'll look at it. And they look at it primarily from a supply-side standpoint, which is fine. Do we have high-speed internet, for example, and where's it available? And that's important. One of the things we do, though, is we go, let's go a step deeper. Let's begin to look at who your potential users are. Your hospital, your schools, your local government, but also your entrepreneurs. Not only what is the technology they need, but what are the application support that they need. And I think from a company standpoint, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of rural telcos over the years, helping folks figure out how to optimize that technology becomes a really important part of the equation in growing customers that are really sophisticated. Just as we've gone through the process of figuring out how to really effectively use video conferencing in very small places, that was a learning curve, and we had to have help in figuring out how to do that effectively so it was more of an asset than a deterrent or a sideshow. So I think this becomes part of it, But we need to move past just the infrastructure piece and really talk about who are the users and how do we help them become more effective in the use of the technology.
All right, Gary, these are your peers. So this is a group that knows what it takes to build a gig network. We just heard the previous panel, and obviously we'd like a lot more financial support to do it. But I think about kind of how innovative you've been. You've already been doing a lot of work with fiber to the prem. You had a fiber prem network. And then you go with this live gig network. So what did that take technically? What additional investments did you all need to make to do it? And I'd love to kind of hear what drove that. Were you kind of looking at your map one day and said, you know what, we just need to go? Or just love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I love the question, and we get this a lot from our peers as well. It's interesting. We didn't start out one day and said, we should have a gigabit network. Let's just make a gigabit network. Quite to the contrary, we just decided that fiber was the right technology, and we decided that 10 years ago, or 11 years ago. So since 2004, really that's just been our technology choice as we're doing upgrades, as we're doing expansions, what have you. We sort of backed into the situation really in that 10 years, 11 years later, we have a fully fiber network. And it's our perspective that, there are a couple of scary things about going gig, I think. One is obviously what are the bandwidth demands going to be and, that part. But I think as a cooperative, as a member-owned entity, we looked at it and said, if we've got the capability to do gigabit service, we've used our members' investment in our cooperative for 10, 11 years to put a fiber network. Why would we limit that? Why would we not enable whatever this technology can deliver? And so it really wasn't, many years of planning to get to a gigabit network. It was just the right thing to do at the right time. It is scary internally because there are some unknown impacts. We're learning more as we go along, of course, but a bit of uncertainty on what will offering a gig residentially to our businesses, how will it impact our network, what are the costs, to your point. And I think you'll find that it's not as impactful. It's manageable. So thus far, and it's early, we just did a September announcement. We started hooking up our first gigabit customers in January. So it's early, but the early trends are that it's not overly impactful. And you can do things within your network to better situate yourself to handle those demands. I mean, I'll give you an example. If you think of where 60% of your network capacity is going to some flavor of video, right? Whether it's Google's YouTube or if it's Netflix. And we experience the same thing. But we are fortunate that we have got now more of a partnership with them and have a caching arrangement so that 60% of our bandwidth isn't hitting our upstream pipes. So it's an example. Now, granted, those things require some scale in your company before Netflix will talk to you about caching servers. But that doesn't mean that groups of your companies can't band together. And we all have transport groups we're talking to or a part owner of. And all these things are opportunities to work together, and it's another way to work together to limit some of the impact that gig can have. And so I think there's also a price discussion. Now I know we won't have an antitrust kind of price discussion.
Don Richards is in the front row.
No, without numbers, it's also kind of fun to talk about your perspective on. Okay, so I offer 20 meg today. Is 50 times my 20 meg price the right gig price? And I've seen companies that go at it kind of that way, and that's a safe way to do it. Makes your accountants happy and everybody else. I don't know who would ever buy it, and I don't know what the end game is. But you can take that perspective. I think we're looking at more like the cost of a PC just gets more powerful and more powerful, but it's strangely enough the same price all the time, right? I think it's somewhat that way with residential broadband. There's a window of opportunity which is workable for your members and your customers that makes sense. So some of the parameters that we looked at, but it wasn't a flash cut.
So how did you come up with that number? So did you actually go out and do market research? Did you talk to consumers and say how much would you pay? Was there, some analysis? And I'm really curious on your take rates. I know it's really early. I know you just rolled it out. But, what you're seeing on the residential side and if you're seeing anything on the enterprise side.
Well, we are seeing a lot of excitement, and it is early. And we've got two things going on right now. We have some of our already built CLEC areas that we're with existing customers that we're now offering the gig service. And we also have greenfield areas that we are expanding to with fiber networks. So they're new customers to us, new members. And we're offering gig there. And there is a noticeable difference in early take rates. it's a bit of a conversation to have with existing customers about why I need to go from your baseline 20 meg, which is what we offer everywhere as a minimum. Why do I need to go to these higher speeds? As opposed to the conversation you have with a new customer that says, this is us. We're the gigabit provider. Here's our speeds for gigabits or portions of gigabits. And so the take rates in new greenfield areas has been quite a bit higher, actually, than our existing areas.
Interesting. That's interesting. So, Joe, I want to go back to a point you made about, here you had these folks approach you. I look at our member companies that we have who are doing amazing things. There's a lot of fiber out there in rural America. But part of that is that critical conversation. It's how do you get that conversation going between a local leadership and a provider in the area before people will default to this whole muni entry, which, obviously is of concern. We look a lot at how do you create a public-private partnership. But I'm curious, and if you have some thoughts and some insights in terms of how do folks here actually initiate some of those discussions, and how do we maybe do a better job of informing local policymakers the capacity that actually exists where people may not even assume they exist?
Right. I can't oversimplify how every elected official might approach this, but I do think that because there will be multiple different ways. But if you have a community that's engaged, and if you have elected leaders that are engaged in their city, I think there are two things that you can assume in trying to have that dialogue. First, that there's a level of interest in this that's different than it's been in the past. And that really has to do with the awareness that is now out there around fiber to the home and gigabit infrastructure. And cities at any size, from a town up to a large city, we're competitive in nature. I mean, we want our town to be the best, and we want to offer our town, the best opportunities we can. And I think that the best elected officials at the local level have that in them. And they're going to be excited about having this engagement, because the second part of this, again, not oversimplifying, there are some cities that will see this as an opportunity and have the capacity to build a muni network on their own. But I will say, in my estimation, there's a large chunk of towns and cities that see this as something that needs to happen in their community, but don't have the wherewithal or politically aren't in a position to go out and indebt that town or city to the level required in order to build this kind of network. And there's the opportunity for a public-private partnership. Because the city's running in a bunch of different directions at the same time, and they certainly have infrastructure needs already on their plate that they have to manage with existing streets, sewers, sidewalks, all of those things that require the resources that the city has. There's pressure from your elected constituency to pay less in taxes but demand more services. And so all of that sits there. And then you see, oh my goodness, if I want my city or town to keep up, I've got to be worried about this infrastructure, this fiber thing that's going on that I see happening. How do I get that to my town? So there's the impetus for the conversation. Leadership that really wants their city or town to progress, an interest and awareness around fiber infrastructure that probably wasn't there 5 or 6 years ago, competitiveness to make sure that you're not the last guy standing with the opportunity, and then finally the practical reality of, if I see all of those things, how can I do this in my city? And I think that if you come forward and engage with an opportunity that perhaps you can be that kind of partner that can allow the city to take the next step, I think that's the beginning of can be the beginning of a very fruitful conversation with any size city that has elected officials that are interested in bettering the place that they call home.
So, Joe, as you were talking, it really struck me, one of the things that we find is that, these folks here have done a marvelous job of covering their communities with fiber capacity. But there's obviously larger providers that are more focused on some of the more lucrative markets. So, I'm going to invest in Denver instead of the eastern plains of Colorado. So I think your perspective would be really interesting in terms of these folks aren't going to be meeting the local mayor of that town that is served by an unnamed large carrier that's not bringing fiber into that community, in the local coffee shop. So how do they, are there entities, are there organizations, are there suggestions that you have, having been in that position of of where some of these connections can even be made, because when I hear about a lot of the really interesting partnerships, it's somebody goes to church together, or somebody, they get together for coffee once a month. I think that's going to take a little bit more creativity, but I'm kind of curious from your perspective, are there some places, are there some entities we could be looking at to again, get the right people in the room?
Yeah, this is going to seem simplistic in a formula, but it really is true. I think it's true in Kansas City, Kansas, and I think it's true in nearly any town or city. There are two constituencies that I think reaching out to and engaging beyond the folks at City Hall that matter a lot. One, schools. I mean, in Kansas City, Kansas, the idea that even if you weren't going to use gigabit speeds, fiber infrastructure at your house, but the children in your city would have that opportunity, and that it could better their learning and enrich their lives. Huge, huge impetus for engagement within the community. And I think that in the cities and towns that I've been to, educating children in the place you call home is a big deal and very important. And I think reaching out to that constituency can be powerful, and the dialogue you can have around that, I think, can be amazing. The second is economic development. And I'll just relate it the way we sort of thought about it in Kansas City, Kansas. We have examples of where infrastructure is built and it leads to economic development. And probably the strongest one, for good or bad, depending on where you are highways. I mean, highways are built as infrastructure, not just to move folks quickly from one place to the other. Of course, that's what they do. But the promise is, and we've seen it happen countless times across the United States, is when you put that highway together and you have an interchange, the promise is that there will be some development that's attracted to that place, to that infrastructure. In much the same way we see fiber to the home, certainly in Kansas City, Kansas, and I think you're seeing evidence of this throughout the country, is I can't tell you exactly what economic development may come because we put this infrastructure in the ground, but I can tell you that the likelihood is this infrastructure will give you the opportunity to develop around your economy in ways that you may have not predicted. In Kansas City, Kansas, our economic development structure is we put the infrastructure in, we go out, we try to bring the big fish to town. Get that company to move to Kansas City, Kansas, jobs come with them, we consider that a win. With fiber to the home, the first thing that happened wasn't that at all. The first neighborhood that was turned on, a middle class, 1950s, Midwestern part of our community, entrepreneurs started coming and renting houses to get access to affordable gigabit speeds. Not just entrepreneurs from Kansas City. We had entrepreneurs coming from Boston, from Denver, from the places that are really known for technology. And, we're the smaller of the two Kansas cities, quite frankly, 150,000 folks. I don't think anybody quite predicted it would be Kansas City, Kansas that would get this infrastructure. But just offering that infrastructure brought entrepreneurs to our city to live and to work. Without the city offering a single tax incentive, all we did was offer the opportunity for synchronous gigabit speeds in a particular part of the community. And on their own, you can look this up on the internet. It's called the Kansas City Startup Village. There's between 25 and 30 entrepreneurs that are in this part of our community that are starting and creating businesses, and some of them are growing to scale. So there'll be one, I'll just tell you, I get excited about this in my city. There's a company called iVerify, and iVerify has a way to unlock a phone by looking at your eye. They were just in they've received rounds of funding. They were just in Barcelona for the Mobile World Congress, and they've formed a relationship with 2 mobile phone manufacturers, and they're going to deploy this technology, which was created in Kansas City, Kansas. It's amazing. I don't think anybody could have predicted it. But that's kind of thing that's going on at the grassroots level. And I guess, my sense of it is that, we're not Silicon Valley. We're not the big Kansas City. We're not Denver. We're Kansas City, Kansas, a Midwestern kind of place that is proud of who we are and doing a lot of good things. And yet young people and entrepreneurs started coming to our place because of this infrastructure. That's the kind of thing I think you can have a dialogue with folks in a community about around economic development.
You're like a proud dad. That was very nice.
Sorry.
And I'm curious, have they stayed?
Well, quite frankly, they're going to stay in Kansas City, but they're moving out of the village. They just quite frankly have outgrown it, and they may end up being in our sister city, Kansas City, Missouri. But we consider that a win for the long haul because we're in one particular metropolitan area, And they're creating jobs now, and those jobs and the spillover effects will go everywhere. We'd love to keep them in Kansas City, Kansas, but that's part of the new challenge for economic development. If you're growing small businesses that grow big, how do you keep them there? That's a great challenge to have, by the way. That's the kind of thing I think local officials want to see happen, because quite frankly, the odds of you keeping someone in your town that grew their business there, in my estimation, is much better than trying to attract someone from another town to your place. And the costs are different too. Here we didn't offer a single tax incentive to get that thing to happen.
Very nice. So on that theme, so, you know, that whole drive of re-immigration to rural America, there have been some really interesting studies, and I'm sure some folks in this room have actually taken a look at it, where they've actually studied the younger demographics. And they've said, you know, when you kind of get there, where do you want to live? And there's this huge re-emphasis on rural America, suburban America. You know, it's that idea that my 22-year-old who lives in Manhattan at some point is going to get kind of tired of Manhattan, and she's going to want some space. What kind of trends, Don, are you all seeing, and are there things that your center is doing to try to capture that trend, work with folks to entice these communities to become more attractive for that re-immigration?
Right. Well, there's two really important pieces of research, and my colleague Craig Schroeder was at your executives meeting in Florida, and Craig shared some of this. The first is what you were referring to, and that is while the predominant trend continues to be rural to urban migration, there's this significant counter trend, and it really represents two distinct groups of people. The folks that are kind of in that 25, but particularly that 30 to 34-year age cohort, and then early retirees. And there's significant remigration back to rural communities. And again, it comes back to this theme that there are choices people are making. And if you think about that young couple with kids, they're making a choice to say, I want to raise my kids in a setting like I had. I want to be close to family. I want to pursue certain things. And this represents a huge opportunity for those communities that are prepared to not only welcome folks back, because sometimes that can be hard, but also are they creating the kinds of job opportunities? Now, people are willing to make sacrifices, but are we creating the kinds of entrepreneurial businesses in these communities that are going to be attractive and allow these folks to come back? So that's the first trend, and I'll illustrate it. But the second trend, I think, is even more exciting, and that is through the center with groups all over North America, we've done surveys primarily of late middle school through early college of young people, and then followed up with focus groups. I think over 70,000 surveys have been done across the country. And what we consistently find is that there is somewhere between 35 and 50% of the young people, depending upon the community, that indicate that if they felt they had the ability to come back to that community or to a similar community, that would be their life choice. And again, it's families, it's friends, it's the kinds of things that they want to do. But in most cases, those folks are saying, I don't think I can come back because either the community isn't encouraging me to come back. I don't know about you, but when I left Ogallala, Nebraska, my folks said, your future's someplace else. It's not in Ogallala. Or there's not those economic opportunities. You know, bottom line, the technology begins to represent a powerful tool to, first of all, young people are not going to live in a community without it. They're simply not. And second, the kinds of businesses that we need to grow and can grow really are tied to the technology. A quick story, great example, Western Carolinas. We ran across this gentleman. He had a salvage yard, an automobile salvage yard. You know, pretty plain, unsophisticated business. He had a passion for European sports cars and had kind of built a reputation for a place to go if you needed parts for a particular kind of European sports car. And it was regionalized. It wasn't, you know, a big deal. It was kind of a side business. But it changed fundamentally, and I think this is the face of the opportunity, when his daughter, who had gone away to the university, got interested in information technology, came back and said, Dad, I want to move back. I want to have my family here, but I don't want to run the junkyard. But what if we take this thing, the worldwide net, and we use it to find supply for these parts and to customers? Well, today you'll find that there's a business with about 25 employees that is one of the major brokerages for these kinds of parts worldwide. That's the face of innovation. That's what's happening, and the technology becomes important. The neat thing is you've got these two trends that are there if you're willing to recognize them that can help drive that kind of development.
So, Donna, it struck me when Joe was talking about the startup village. Do you know, Kansas City, Kansas, it's still big time for our folks and where we come from. Do you see an opportunity to create that kind of a concept in a rural community? Is there a way to kind of look at, you've got a town of 5,000, can you start a startup community? I mean, are there, you know, do you see that at all?
Absolutely.
Is anybody talking about it?
We're seeing it everywhere. And again, it's the fact that you have people that are making lifestyle choices. And they need to make a living. And they're utilizing the technology as part of a way to make that living. And what's critical is for the community to step back and take a look at that. And wherever we go, when we start mapping entrepreneurial talent, we find pockets of this. And if you then become intentional and say, how do we support that? Then you have the ability to grow that. And so there's wonderful examples that we can point to where that's happening and it's possible. I find it in communities of 200-300, and maybe it's only a handful, but that's the deal changer that could ensure that that community has a future down the road.
Okay. So, Gary, you talked about, you know, you've already been building this fiber network. You have a really progressive board. Your board's been very active. We always see them here at meetings. They're very engaged, always in learning sessions. But, you know, this is also still a leap, you know, so how did you work through this with your board to kind of say, look, we're thinking about doing this? Because the other thing that I find that always strikes me about our industry is it's a really modest industry. I think that actually plays sometimes to your detriment because you just build the networks and you don't, you know, kind of get up there and say, hey, look at us, we're doing a gig zone. So I'm curious about both, kind of, first of all, working with your board, and second of all, that decision to basically be willing to stand on a platform and said, we built this amazing network, come check us out.
Well, as a newbie CEO, yes, I have an awesome board, of course. They're here. No, but, you know, I think it's more, we're technically able to do this, but really the conversation was much about it's the right thing to do. We can do it. It'll benefit our members. It'll benefit the region and the communities we serve. So, you know, right in our mission statement, it talks about economic development for us. And it's woven in everything we do. And I really think that was the conversation. We can do this. It's the right thing to do. Our members have contributed. Let's do this that way. And boy, we've seen the things you guys are talking about in terms of economic development and impact in our community. And it's not the size of yours, but it's a good-sized community. Communities, really, it's more of a regional approach that we're doing. But we have things happening like a Fortune 100 bank contacted us. And they had heard of this GigaZone thing, and you know, what's that all about? But really, they were looking at doing a call center, and should that be overseas? Should that be in another metropolitan area to diversify their Minneapolis operations? Or there's this thing going on in our backyard in northern Minnesota. Maybe we should talk to those people. And you know, I don't know that anything will come of that conversation, but the fact that a major bank, international bank, is talking about something we can do. That's the economic development benefit and impact that this can have even in our size community. And it really, I mean, it almost comes down to very little about how many people take gigabit. I mean, they'll take it if they need it, and if there's the application, it's there, and we're ready to provide it. But it isn't necessarily about that. It's almost a perception that we've brought to this region that we serve that I think has been the right thing to do. We can and we have. And you talk about tooting your own horn. Well, I had my first ever press conference. That was a new thing. And we're not in the habit of doing that. But I can tell you it has paid off in this perception that I'm talking about. If you do good things, you don't tell anybody, that bank's not calling you, and then that next innovator isn't coming to your town because they don't know what you're doing. And so you are kind of forced to talk about it. And we've had a lot of fun. I mean, we've had support from our governor, and as you know, our senators are very supportive. We've had a lot of visible support for what we're doing. And I think it all wraps into just this concept where I started, which is It's the right thing to do. You know, it's why we are there. We are there to provide services. It's not about the bottom line, and this fits right around that. You know, what we're now empowering our whole region, 5,000 square miles, to be able to do to the businesses they can attract. That's what we should be doing.
So as you're talking, it really struck me. So you've got this entity, this large corporate entity that's come to you, and you have a good conversation. Do you have the pieces in place internally to take in the next step? So have you, to do the look where it's quality of life, it's local jobs? I mean, are you working with like local economic development entities to kind of help shore up the bid to get this business? Are you doing things internally? I'm just curious because it's kind of like this opportunity's come and then it's like, okay, now now what do we do with it? What's the next step?
Yeah, we are very fortunate to have a very good relationship with our local economic development people. And we have gone from, occasionally participating when a business is coming to town to leading those conversations typically. We had a very nice visit with a potential business here just a few weeks ago, and he followed up with us after and said, you know what, you were the game changer. You were what swung it from the many communities they're looking at to our community. It was about our meeting with them. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing, I thinking about that meeting we had with this company was it was about infrastructure, but at the same time they were talking about our culture. And what they gathered when they walked in our front office and the kind of cooperative we are, and they could kind of feel the mission statement we're talking about, right? And so as much as you have to have, we have GIG, that's why they're at the table with us. They left talking about our culture, how the employees are, how we're really there, a very service-oriented entity. And so that whole package, our economic development individual he likes us a lot right now,
I would think you're
and
popular.
we like him. It's a perfect relationship that we're front end. If you talk about growing business, we're great for him, but he's great for us too. We're in the early conversations with potential businesses. So you think when they come to town then, they've heard of Paul Bunyan. In the past, they would tend to the large Arbach that's in our town because that's who they've heard of. That's who they use in their other community. But now we've inserted ourselves into that conversation. So it's good for us too.
Had you been building that relationship and even as you were thinking about rolling out with the GIG, did you give your economic development people, here's some materials, here's some things to share, here's some things to include in your packet? Or was it just kind of as you were doing your rollout, it was part of the checklist, or had they been brought in a little bit earlier into the process?
He was involved with our rollout long before we had our rollout. So we prepared him. He's got tools that he uses. He certainly knows we're welcome to be a part of these meetings. He spoke at our announcement event along with the other folks I talked about. Our local university president spoke. There's a very community feel to that, but he's front and center in everything we've been doing. Nice. When we're going to roll something out, we're talking to him first. And so it reciprocates very well. Nice.
So I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, Joe, going back to Kansas City. So one of the things that I saw recently is that AT&T is now charging $70 for their gig service. So some nice competition you got going now. But they're also charging $29 more to ensure that there is privacy, that they will not track your usage. And they're very, very public about this offer. And I think it's kind of their way of contrasting, well, you can do Google, but, then you get Googled or whatever people like to say, and that they know where you're going at all times. I'm kind of curious. We're at this really interesting crossroads where people want as much capacity as they can get, but we want our privacy, and we've got cybersecurity concerns and all those other issues. So I'm kind of curious how you see that reconciliation between capacity of a network and the privacy and the security of the networks, and just if there's, your perspective on that.
Well, we're a city that formed a public-private partnership to accomplish the gigabit network, and of course we would offer the same opportunity to an incumbent or another new entrant if they chose to come in. My sense of it is that if you can get to the place where you have competition in a private marketplace, then, if security and privacy is important, then that'll be valued in a way, and I think that will allow the consumer to make that choice. I think that what was important to us when we looked at this from a municipal standpoint in our reluctance to go forward to have a municipal system in and of itself was that you will be competing in the private marketplace. And we were very reluctant on behalf of our citizens to put our to put investment dollars in front of a highly competitive market, where now the municipal entity would be out in a competitive way. This was talked a little bit in the last panel, in trying to figure out how to make this profitable. And so our decision was that the risk reward here in the public-private partnership was to allow our community to get gigabit speeds, reduce our exposure financially, and then hopefully the competition in the marketplace would allow for decision-making to come around what citizens or consumers value relative to the service that they end up deciding to consume. And I think you're starting to see that happen. I would be willing to venture that you will see other offerings by providers that sort of speak to values or interests that a consumer may have. And I think that's good for the marketplace. And for us, and I think for many cities, not being involved in a competitive atmosphere is a smart decision on behalf of your community to make. Let me say one last thing about this relative to what I think for cities and towns. And we had a little bit of a discussion around this just in our panel. If you look at young people today and the way that they consume the economy by way of device, and I'll give you examples. I mean, my kids will be the ones that argue for gigabit speed no matter what. They're the best salesmen in our house, and we'll give in to them, which we did. But if you look at the way even some of us do business today, we think nothing of the fact of interacting with our bank in a handheld device that requires bandwidth in order for us to continue that transaction. Think about for cities, how are we interacting with our citizens? Are we providing them with the opportunity to interact with us in the way that they're used to interacting with the rest of the economy? And I would say for the most part, cities are behind here. And I think that cities and towns that figure out how to use technology and infrastructure like this to provide citizens with a conduit to them in a service standpoint will be at fantastic advantages over time in talking about quality of life and differentiator for trying to attract people to your community. The last thing I'll say is I'm a big believer in transparency. Every elected official you'll hear will talk about being transparent. It's like the buzzword that's out there in the world. At some point, transparency will translate into the ability for citizens to completely interact with your city through a network. That's in my estimation. And the cities that figure out how to get there quickly or quicker will be at big advantages in providing the kind of quality that you want to have in local government that I do think can be enticing to either keep people living where they call home today or attract people to that place, because of really part of it is the reputation you start to develop. We're a community that gets how to interact with you, that understands how to bridge those gaps. And I think all of this technology starts to center on those abilities and advantages for a city.
So Gary, following up on Joe's point, so the value proposition, the I'm willing to pay more for security, are you getting any of that from your customers? Are you getting folks who are even making that connection between I've got this capacity, but now I'm worried about my privacy, my security, cyber issues? Does that pop up for you as a provider?
Well, certainly we talk about it internally a lot, and we've always taken the tack that we're going to err on the side of security. We're erring on the side of not being invasive into our members' services. So, our IT manager's out in the audience. He would always argue for not sending that spam email or not that newsletter, or we're not doing this, we're not filtering that. It's a very hands-off approach, and I think they respect us that way, and they expect us to be behaving that way. But it is a balance. I mean, you look at all the tools for network monitoring that we have, all the things that really could be useful tools to help them better use a gigabit service in their house, they being the consumer. Those same tools could come off as a little big brother-ish, that, yes, I can see you're having trouble with your iPad and when you connect it to this site. And so we are walking that fine line on being leveraging the advantages that our network and technologies and monitoring and all this can have with that security issue. But I think our default, when given the choice, will be to err on the side of security and transparency and not play that role. So I don't think we'll ever have that $30 difference in our price for the one that we can spy on you price. I don't think we'll have that.
That's a heck of a marketing tool.
Yeah.
And Don, you're not a regulatory expert in this area, but I know you've been around it. One of the things that we always find is, people want the speed, and your entrepreneurs want the speed, and small businesses want the speed, but the ability for people to actually understand that these networks have a cost, and that it's expensive to build it. And I guess you're probably in some ways perfectly positioned to kind of, how do we kind of get folks to understand that networks are living, breathing. It's not just the capital expense; it's the operating expense as well. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts in terms of how we get users to understand that as well.
Well, it's a huge issue, and I appreciate the question. I'm an economist by training, and any way you cut it, most of the rural areas you could define as high cost, low density, because it's low density, and so there is a price. And so in our work with rural communities, one of the first conversations we have is you've got to understand your reality, your situation. Everybody has competitive advantages and disadvantages, and if you're very rural, low density, and higher cost, then you've got to be much more intentional and much more proactive to make sure you can generate the demand, whether that's to get same-day parcel service or any other kind of critical commerce amenity. And so I love the idea of public-private partnership. We encourage our communities to work proactively with their providers, and if they've got a provider who's willing to weigh in with them, not only on the technology, but also I think this huge question of education, consumer education around how to use the technology, that's just a huge gap right now. But it also then represents a huge opportunity. And there's communities that grab that and they make it work, and they're not disadvantaged. And there's communities that fail to do that, and they're going to find themselves behind the curve and potentially at risk.
All right, in our last minute, gig networks, hype or the future? Joe, what do you think?
It's the future. Absolutely. It's amazing what it's been doing in Kansas City, and I'd say that, I think there's a little hype out there. There's a little spin. I think that's good. It brings awareness. But what we're seeing happen in Kansas City is very real and substantive.
I can't imagine a world in which that's not the case.
And, it can be viewed as hype. I talked about how we don't have everybody subscribing to a gig. But why not let them make that choice? Why not empower your consumers to have the best they can have? And if they don't need a gig, they don't need a gig. It's up to them.
Terrific. Well, if you will all join me in thanking our terrific panelists. Really appreciate it.
Very good. Joe.
Went fast. I enjoyed it.
Yep.
Thank you, Joe.
Shirley. Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our second general session. Concurrent sessions start at 10:30, and this session's adjourned.